Hello, everybody. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Bienvenidos a esa conversa. I'm delighted to host today our first talk of the People Gov Speaker Series of the People in Government Lab at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford University. The purpose of these talks is to create a space where academics, practitioners, and decision makers from public and private sector can exchange ideas, can talk about the most pressing issues regarding people and government performance. And also we want to create a community. We want to build a community and exchange and have this space to exchange ideas. This is one of the actions that we are doing as part of the People in Government Lab. And we want, with the purpose, to build a bridge between the academia and policy making and to create a network of knowledge. The People in Government Lab was created last year in October of 2019 with the purpose of studying and understanding how can we motivate public employees, how can we improve their performance, and how can we build better governments around the world. We have been working in the last year in different topics related with public employees' motivations, also projects understanding how can we improve public employees' performance. And in the last couple of months, we have been studying and trying to understand how governments are dealing with remote work and how they are facing the challenges that this new arrangement of work is bringing. Today, I am honored to share this space with Tsedal Neeley, a professor of Business Administration at Harvard University, and with Henna Khan, who is the head of the UK Civil Service Human Resources Strategy and Innovation Unit. We want to discuss today how can we understand how governments are what are the challenges that governments are facing, what governments can do to improve the way that they are working remotely. What are the opportunities? We recognize that there are many challenges that governments are facing, but also there are opportunities that working remotely has brought for public organizations in different areas, such as productivity, well-being, organizational culture, managerial practices, and modernization. And the idea is to have an open conversation and also to share how can we take advantage of this opportunity? How can also we start to think in the future? How can we reimagine the way that governments are working around the world? And how can we reimagine public service? It is a real pleasure to be here. And to start, I'm going to introduce Tsedal Neeley, who is Naylor Fishott Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Her work focuses on how leaders can scale their organizations by developing and implementing global and digital strategies. She regularly advises leaders around the world in virtual work and large-scale change that involves global expansion, digital transformation, and how can organizations become more agile. And she has a book that is going to be published next year about remote work revolution, succeeding from anywhere. It is a pleasure to have you here, Tsedal, and we are looking forward to hear your ideas, your experience, and your research. Thank you so much.
It's great to be with you.
We have also today Henna Khan, and Henna Khan leads the Civil Service Human Resources Strategy and Innovation Units that coordinates and delivers key strategic activities, including modernization and reform and cross-cutting commissions with senior stakeholders in governments, such as public accounts committees and inquirers. In addition to the strategy task that she is responsible, the Strategic and Innovation Unit also hosts the People Lab, we share more or less the name, which is an innovation sandbox for the human resources function, building human resources capabilities on using evidence to experiment and innovate to drive better outcomes across governments. The unit works collaborating with key academics and institutions, and they, as part of their team, they have a multidisciplinary researchers who apply evidence approaches and also who works with different institutions to make public employees' experience better. Thank you so much, Henna, to join us in the conversation. So as you know, in March of this year, all of us, we changed the way that we live and the way that we work, and governments weren't the exceptions. Many governments needed to change from day one to day two the way that they are working, and they needed also to start to think and to implement new strategies to improve the work and their productivity and well-being. In some countries, for example, such as Brazil, public employees move from working from in person in their offices almost from 0 to 63%. And in other agencies, for example, in Colombia, they move the entire agency to work remotely. So we are facing this challenge. There are technical challenges, there are technical skills that public employees need to develop. But what we have seen in our research is that also there are other type of challenges that are maybe less tangible, but are very important, such as work-life balance, socialization, isolation, and also the question that came out with different conversation is also how can we continue building a sense of belonging and also a commitment with the organization while we are not sharing the same space. So this is a little of background of what we have been facing, and I would love now to hear from Tsedal Neeley, her thoughts and her experience on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. Wow, you took me right back to March 8th, which is the date where Harvard Business School, along with 20,000 others at Harvard University, migrated to working from home in a period of 5 days. In fact, we started teaching remotely in a period of 5 days. At that time, many of my colleagues hadn't even heard of Zoom, much less this idea of working from home. So listen, that period, 2020, in the first few weeks, who could have ever imagined that a microscopic virus would send the majority of knowledge workers worldwide to become remote workers? And this has happened from Qatar to Saudi Arabia, to China, to Nigeria, all parts of the world, Latin America, and of course, where I am, the US. So we went from a world that had employees who worked virtually, sometimes full-time, sometimes some of the time at around a 20%, 24% rate, to about 88 to 90% of knowledge workers went home because of this pandemic. And so these rapid and wide changes, the scale of which Margarita described and that I'm describing, has never seen before. It's unprecedented. But remote work is not new. In fact, the very first academic piece written around remote collaboration is actually about 44 years old. At 1976 is when it was first written. And the idea of how to think about social presence when working remotely, immediacy, intimacy is the type of work that people started. And then you have Silicon Valley companies like Cisco or Sun Microsystems, later acquired by Oracle, that have been actively testing this idea of remote work and productivity since about 1990, 1993. And so if you think about this remote work revolution that we've all now experienced, which is why I'm titling the book Revolution, because it is so big now. But the idea itself, the practical nature of remote work is not only not new, but we know a lot about how to make it work for people, for organizations, for institutions. So here's what I'll say in my just opening remarks. The two topics that are most examined in this area by practitioners, by scholars, etc., the two most studied areas, guess what they are? One, productivity. Makes sense. Can you perform as you would want to, or the output that you want to? Can it be achieved in a remote work environment? The second most examined topic in remote work is trust. How do I trust people I barely see? How do I trust employees' use of time? How do I develop trust from a distance? Because in the absence of trust, people are not feeling secure about themselves, about their colleagues, about their organization, about their livelihood, about their jobs. Two most studied topics. The good news is we know a lot about how to develop trust in remote work. And the key question is, when it comes to trust, is it's not do I trust someone or not, it's how much do I need to trust them in order to achieve this goal. So I talk about a trusting curve. You know, learning curve, we talk about the learning curve all the time, climbing up a learning curve. In remote work, you have this idea of the trusting curve. You need passable trust or sufficient trust. You need the trust that you need for tasks and collaboration, and different type of trust or emotional trust when it comes to interpersonal relationships and mentoring and coaching. So that's the one thing that I'll share there. In terms of productivity, the evidence is robust and has been studied all over the world, in collectivistic countries and individualistic countries, in tech companies and non-tech companies, consumer products companies. The evidence shows that productivity actually goes up with remote work, not down, provided some conditions are met. Like, is the home condition correct? Is it conducive for remote work? It's not always conducive when you have spaces that are too small, for example. When the pandemic hit, one of the biggest problems that people had in places like New York City, Manhattan, and San Francisco is people living in quarters or apartments that are too small, 2, 3 roommates, not enough space to do work. So the home condition is not right. Sometimes families with very small children sharing space, partners, parents, spouses, each of them needing space. So home conditions is one thing. The second thing is leadership. When you don't have a leader who's been skilled or upskilled on how to lead remotely, anywhere from motivation to setting expectations to focusing on process versus outcome, etc., guess what happens? It affects people's performance. So those types of conditions have to be met. And so as I move to close my remarks before Margarita just pushes the mute button on me, is I'd like to say that some of the trends that we're seeing, because I track companies, not only current state, but also future plans, the trends that we're seeing is that companies are going to retain remote work in one form or another. And what I think is going to happen, looking at the patterns, is that companies are going to have 1 to 2 to 3 days of remote work, or people wanting to retain remote work, but not full-time remote work. So it's more of a hybrid solution. There'll be certain companies like Dropbox, if some of you are familiar with Dropbox, who have come out with statements like, we're going to be a virtual first company. Completely new idea. or Dell computers worldwide are asking their massive workforce to take up full-time remote work from here on. And then places like insurance company in the US saying that we don't need to pay these high prices that we're paying for real estate. We are going to give people the option to work from home. And based on that, we'll think about our real estate investments. So I think we're going to see a shifting of work patterns in many organizations. I also think that we're going to see some kind of redistribution of the population at large when people begin to get talent from wherever and have them join their organization. The geographical boundary is becoming less and less important, whether it's nationally or internationally. So those are my predictions, which means that we better understand how to develop healthy organization cultures that has members who are working remotely while others are not. And every single person needs to develop remote work skills.
Thank you so much, Tsedal. Thank you so much. I think that you highlight very, very interesting points about trust, about leadership, and that it seems not that your prediction is like remote work has a right to stay, and it's gonna. We need to understand how it works. We need to develop the skills. I'm gonna come back with some questions after this because I really would like, and I think that the audience might have some questions about how these private, because these are like some private sector examples, how this can be applied to the public sector. And I think that Henna Khan participation would give us some good understanding of that, and then we can exchange some ideas. Henna, please join us with your remarks.
Thank you, Margarita, and thank you, Tsedal. There were some really, really interesting points made there. So from my perspective, I'm going to talk about it from the People Lab's perspective in terms of how it changed the kinds of work that we were looking at and the way that we were working, and then also in the context of the civil service as a whole and my department cabinet officer's role and how we were impacted by the pandemic and the need to work remotely. So from our experience, this shift happened almost overnight, although we could see it about to take place over a couple of weeks in the lead up to that point. And for us in the UK civil service, we pride ourselves on flexible working. So one of the really big points that makes us attractive as an employer is the fact that we offer a work-life balance, different working patterns, and the options to work from home in the majority of our roles. However, for some departments, given that the size of the civil service is just under 500,000, just under 500,000, across 23 different ministerial departments and 20 different non-ministerial departments, that's not to mention the 413 plus agencies and other public bodies that sort of exist within this 500,000 workforce. Some colleagues did work in roles where predominantly they would rarely be working from a computer. So civil servants who work in the Department for Work and Pensions, for example, in the job centres, or civil servants who work as air accident investigators. So the breadth and diversity of the workforce really changed the way in which we were working when we switched to remote working. And for some roles, there was a very different way of operating due to the fact that we weren't able to interact with our citizens in a face-to-face way in comparison to what we did usually. So it really pushed us to think about the operating model, the way that particular roles worked, in particular the operational delivery lens of government. And I know that those departments worked very quickly to move to a remote working model. And for some departments like HMRC, they were able to do that really rapidly to get the furlough scheme set up. And that was based on people working remotely across boundaries, collaborating at pace. We have a lot of different online meeting software that we use as well. So lots of different systems we use. So at the moment, we use Zoom, we use Google Meet, we also use Microsoft Teams. So there's lots of different ways that we connect with colleagues across departments. But the biggest change for us was moving from those conversations in the office, those social interactions, the emotional intelligence that humans are unique for when we're looking at automation and people, and the fact that the efficacy of that, so the ability to influence people, have really effective conversations, build relationships with new stakeholders and maintain relationships with new stakeholders, completely changed the way in which my team in particular and the People Lab worked. So for us, we were working with colleagues and collaborating with colleagues across different departments. And initially, interoperability was a really big challenge for us. So I mentioned those 3 different types of video conferencing software that we use. They don't always talk to each other. So that was the first challenge that we had. And we have found some workarounds now, but initially that was a challenge, and it was difficult to overcome when you're trying to engage with stakeholders rapidly. And also for us, there was a really big exercise across government where everybody came together for a shared goal. And that shared goal was working hard during this challenging pandemic period to make sure citizens got the services and support that they needed. And more importantly as well, the side of the economy. So colleagues across government in particular roles were looking at ways to protect the economy and looking at the fiscal system that we needed to put in place in the context of the pandemic. So there's obviously they're 2 sides of the same coin, but colleagues across the civil service. So if you imagine over just under 500,000 people all working hard towards this combined shared goal, that was a really powerful, for me, a really powerful message to know that every single person was rallying around a shared purpose to work really hard and make sure that the government was ready and prepared to support the most vulnerable in society, and to make sure that we were prepared for the impacts of the pandemic, whatever that may be. So from my perspective, in terms of a practitioner's perspective on the situation, there was a change to the way that we worked. So from my team and colleagues around me in my specific department in the Cabinet Office, it was changing the way that we work. So usually you would have meetings face to face, and it would be very quick to get stakeholders on board. For me in particular, I really enjoy meeting my stakeholders and being able to build those human interactions and connections. So having to do that virtually did make it slightly harder, because in meetings, you can just meet someone and they're not too sure quite what you want from them. But when you share a virtual invitation, you have to be really clear about what you want from the meeting, why you're randomly putting a meeting in their diary. So for me, the need to communicate even clearer was really, really important, and to dedicate time to identify stakeholders rapidly to start building up that relationship virtually was a really big challenge, and something that we had to change in terms of the way we thought about stakeholder engagement. And then the second thing I wanted to mention was about the way which we work and schedule our days. So Margarita talked about productivity, Tsedal, you talked about productivity as well. And for us, there's lots of different tasks you can do when you're working remotely, because there isn't any office interference with your day-to-day work. So I can count a million times when I've been sat in the office and approached by a different leader or a different stakeholder or a different colleague and get completely sidetracked from the task that I was doing. Whereas when you're working remotely, your schedule, you're more in control and you have more autonomy over your schedule. So in the mornings, I tend to focus on deep work. So things that need no interruption. I block out my diary effectively. I then put in the afternoon tasks that involve meeting or engaging with different stakeholders and having more of a brainstorming activity. So I've scheduled it around energy levels, points where I'm likely to be more highly focused. And then in terms of the other things that have changed in comparison to before we fully went remote working from home used to be something that you'd do if you had like an appointment or something. So it would only be by exception usually. And if somebody did work from home, you'd think, oh, they have maybe they have childcare responsibilities, or there's a reason to work from home. Whereas now I can see a lot of people have been converted to wanting to work from home by default. And for us, that opens up a lot of opportunities, because it means you can offer roles to talented people regardless of where they're based in the country. And that's a really good opportunity, because it supports the country as we think about the supporting the economy and getting things started back up, we shouldn't be taking a one city approach. And taking an approach that's geographically dispersed will enable us to tap into and support through employment lots of different people across the country who can contribute their talents and expertise to the UK civil service. So there are a couple of challenges and opportunities I've discussed. Really happy to go into questions and answers with you now, Margarita.
Thank you so much, Henna. Thank you so much. I think that the first question that I would like to bring to the table is how these findings that Tsedal Neeley highlight, how they can apply in the case of the UK government, but also I think talking more broader, how can this apply to other governments that maybe they didn't have any experience before on working remotely, and this was really a shock to do this. I don't know if Henna and then Tsedal, if they want to.
Yes, I think hearing Tsedal talk about the fact of the trust and then the productivity, I think organisations and other civil service departments can think about that through really focusing on what their purpose is. So what's the vision of the organisation? And then behind that, you rally the staff and you build the trust. So I know every single person in my team is committed to working in the civil service. I know that they really care about their work. So I'd really express that at an organisational level to ensure that everybody's working towards a shared vision. We saw that with civil service departments in the UK because everybody rallied around and dedicated resource to prioritising COVID work. And I'd recommend that if other organisations haven't thought about that already. And another technique as well that I wanted to flag is about dividing your teams. So at the start of the pandemic, I had a team A that was focused on COVID-19 related work, and a team B who kept the people lab and the strategy and the day-to-day business as usual work going, but I allocated that 80-20%. So we could still keep an eye on existing business as usual activity, but the predominant focus of the rest of the team, the rest of the resource, was looking at the problem right on our doorstep and tackling that immediately, and then feeding back to the team in the 20% section, team B, to think about what would this mean for our work when we return to it 100%.
Thank you, Henna. Tsedal.
So it's interesting because there are many organizations that are governmental organizations like the Patent Office in the US, the patent examiners, who actually had been doing experiments with remote work with a portion of their workforce. So they did a study, a major study in the US Patent Office to see if remote work would not only work for their culture, but also increase job satisfaction among their patent examiners. And so they actually found in their experiment that productivity not only did it go up, but the examiners loved the autonomy that they gained, or the freedom that they gained when they worked from home, and also cutting commute time for people increased their general life ease or satisfaction. This is one of the things that you hear a lot about. My commute is gone, and I've been able to be productive, and I love being autonomous. But there's another side to this as well, of course. You're autonomous, your commute is gone, but you're also isolated. And you're professionally isolated, you're personally isolated. So the things that, Henna mentioned, some disruption to your work that you might experience when it's a small amount and it's, I call it either water cooler conversations or tea kettle. Is that what I think in England it's the tea kettle. You run into someone making tea and you're chit-chatting, or the cappuccino moment in other places. That actually helps advance work. The informal contact actually directly helps formal work and formal performance. It also helps people feel connected to one another. So that goes away. And the question always is, how do you recreate it in an authentic way at the workforce? And it's actually quite possible to do that through not only the collaboration that you do together. So you first, when you transition, Margarita, you talked about, we didn't have experience in many of our organizations. So it was a shock. So one of the first things you want to do is you want to make sure that you're replicating the amount of contact, professional and personal, once you're at the home front. And leaders and managers can help facilitate that. But it has to be the right amount, because you also don't want to be controlling people. I saw some questions come in around policies being written for telework, very strict policies. Should they be more general and more open? Here's what we know about remote work. Anytime we try to micromanage remote workers, it's a losing game. You might as well turn people off and create a culture that is not one of trust and of kind of remote success. One of the biggest phenomenons that we saw after March, particularly in the US, is people buying surveillance software. These are the types of things that they ask people to install on their computers to see what websites people visit, the amount of clicks, or to monitor movement. Is there life there? So it takes pictures or screenshots of you, of your work. That is absolutely the worst thing you can do. They call those awareness technologies. There truly are surveillance softwares. And they actually reduce productivity, reduce job satisfaction, and increase turnover. In poor economic times, you have disgruntled people who might tolerate you, but as soon as things get better, they shift, they leave. It's the worst thing you can actually do. The best thing that you can actually do is give people the equipment that they need. That's very important. Home conditions, equipment, and focus on outcomes and not process. The successful remote work leaders don't monitor, but they support, they enable, they empower, and allow people to use their time intelligently. What do I mean by that? There's a concept called flex time. Flex time is you take your 8 hours or however long you're working, and you cut it up in a way that makes sense for you in your remote world. So maybe you're a homeschooling parent. Someone asked about parenting, which, by the way, my husband and I are homeschooling along with our 2 children who are 7 and 10. And just so you know, being a professor gives you no leg up on homeschooling or teaching children. We're just terrible at it, but we're doing it just for safety purposes. So flex time says in the 8 hours that you have, can you work from 6 a.m. till 8:30, get your children set up for home schooling, and then start back up at 10 o'clock and work until a certain time, walk your dog if you want to walk your dog, or go check on your grandma, and then come back and then work again from 3 p.m. till 6. It's how you cut up the time. Remote work allows people to do that. And those are the reasons people thrive in remote environments. The flex time is really important, but it takes for you not only to trust people, you have to trust yourself as a leader, that you are equipping and enabling and also making sure people understand what they need to work on. So all of this to say is remote work in non-for-profit environments have been done, they've been tested, they've been quite successful. And I think we need to take the perspective of, if we give people what they need, the right direction, the right skills, and if we lead and manage in the right ways, it's going to be successful no matter what. But people don't know how to do remote work well. You don't organically or anecdotally know how to do it well. It's a learned skill.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tsedal and Neela. I just want to bring a little about the organizational culture. So when we talk about public organizations, some of these public organizations, they are very hierarchical. They usually have like no specific goals, but these big goals, that this is the goal of the government, and I think that we are talking, and also maybe a more complicated process to make things done. So we are talking about changing one organizational mindset to another other cultural, other mindset. What will be your thoughts about this? How can we move, because we have to do this as soon as possible. We don't want to go back where we were before 8th of March of this year. We want to learn from this process. How can we, one, create organizational learning? How can we make organizations learn from this process? And how can we move for more rigid organizations to more agile and resilient organizations?
So it's interesting because around April, I received a call from a company here working on a COVID vaccine. And they had 65% of their employees going into labs, doing testing, wearing, the suits and PPE and all of that. And 40% were working from home for the first time in the history of this company. And suddenly culture became a problem, us versus them. You all are over there safe and we are here risking our lives. Who's the important people here? Because the important people go in the office, the non-important people are staying. I mean, it's all craziness. And then the CEO was worried that he was losing ground in terms of helping his culture that had a split workforce, meaning some working from home, some not working from home, feeling disconnected, feeling important, not important. The culture begins to suffer. And what did he need to do? So what we ended up doing is probably one of the most important things that you can do to preserve your culture or to even enhance your culture to be more agile is that we kind of did a relaunch of the organization with the right shared goals, shared values that was now remote specific. Some people are remote, some are not, but everyone is valuable and the work that we do is crucial. So really reinforcing the shared values in a way that is very inclusive. So his language had to change and his way of talking to the entire organization had to change. Expressions of we are one organization, all of us focused on our common goal. And let me reassert what that is. The second thing is to truly understand how to create the norms and the behaviors that you want to see and explicitly say what they are. What is organization culture? Organization culture, by definition, is what is our shared values and what are the norms and behaviors that we want to see that are aligned with those. Those have to be explicitly articulated. The thing to understand too is when we have big parts of our organization like we do, and we're all nervous about a second lockdown, frankly, and some of you have seen it already. What people have to understand is that this is a radical change. This is not like, oh, we have to now be in this temporary state. No, we are going through a radical change. Our systems, our processes, our routines, all of those have been upended, and we need to replace them with constructive, productive, effective, and learned ways to do work. That's how you recreate your organization culture, and you have to let go of a number of things and you have to pick up some new things.
Thank you, Tsedal. Henna, do you want to add something?
Yes, I think just to bring to life some of the things that Tsedal has shared, I mentioned earlier about the shared goal and how it felt for me as a civil servant, actually knowing that colleagues, like there's just under 500,000 colleagues all collectively working together towards that shared goal. And the head of the civil service at the time sent a video out to all of the staff across the organization to say, keep doing the work that you're doing, is brilliant. The work you're doing is so important, and reiterating the value and the benefits of being a civil servant during this time. It's a great privilege to be able to contribute to tackling the pandemic, and uniting everybody with that goal really made a big difference. And the other thing that really made a big difference for our culture was using our internal communications to showcase examples of good practice. So we have examples of where teams decided, well, who has a skill that we can learn from one another? Let's use this time to upskill ourselves. Let's use this time to do something virtually, for example, after work, socially, to build those connections. We have a colleague who joined and we still haven't met him in person. So we arranged something after work to connect with him and learn a bit more about him. But regular communications is a really important part. So that internal communications to showcase teams that have been innovative and of their own accord found ways to connect and build connections and showcasing the organizational values. So that was a really good tool, but also using regular communications from senior leaders. So almost every day we have a staff update from the Chief Operating Officer for the Cabinet Office, sharing with us, this is the latest government advice, this is what it means for our department, this is what it means for your work, and here are all the relevant policies or further information that you can access to find out more. In addition to that, she also showcases the employee wellbeing portal, so that staff who may need to access that can access it and use it. So that's a really good example of how the organizational values have actually been coming to the fore through lived examples and good practice.
Thank you so much. I can continue asking questions, but I'm gonna let the audience to participate. Pedro, do you want to share the questions that the audience is asking us?
Yes, for sure, Margarita. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So we received a lot of questions. I'm going to select a few. So Hada Moreno from Oxford, she's asking, what is your perspective of remote working inequality in government organizations? And she mentioned personal situations, single moms, small apartments, domestic violence. It could widen the gap. So how this impact could be minimized? Also, Aung Hein from Oxford asked how to make remote work inclusive.
That's a really good question and an important question, because there's the fear that remote work will leave certain groups behind or will not set certain groups up for success. And so there are a few things to keep in mind. One is organizations and leaders of organizations have to really pay attention to this. And interestingly enough, we've seen places where millennials have struggled because of home conditions that are not great. And we've seen situations where some people literally couldn't log into their workplace in an effective way because of bandwidth issues. And then, of course, the moms or the dads who have to mind children, worrying about how am I going to be able to do this, particularly if there's kind of a professional anxiety for either of them. I think the important thing is to ensure that those who are in leadership understand how to set people up for success, and it might differ for some people. Remember, I talked about flex time. Flex time is important for families, particularly during this pandemic. If you can't embrace flex time, you are actually diminishing people's abilities to work and to work productively. Here's what we found. One of the things that we've found since the pandemic started in March is that people are working longer, more hours than ever before. Why is that? there's a blurring between home and work, the commute being gone, and people are getting burned out, in fact. And part of what you need to do in certain places is to say to people, make sure you take care of yourself, your well-being, and make sure that you keep these boundaries clear, because people are working harder, longer, and in the absence of having proper digital tools norms, they're experiencing what they call Zoom fatigue or tech exhaustion. Why does that happen? Tech exhaustion happens because people schedule meetings edge to edge, which I have as well here because sometimes it happens that way. I really wanted to be with you today, but tech exhaustion is the result of not taking advantage of flex time, not taking advantage of the fact that there are multiple digital tools that you can use. And just because you can schedule meetings edge to edge doesn't mean you should. In fact, you shouldn't. Some things work well through email, asynchronous communication, one to many. We've seen an increase in the use of internal social media or collaboration tools. Sometimes you want to use those instead of yet another meeting, coordinating with a number of people. So all this to say is that understanding how to create the conditions for people to do well, no matter what their situation is very important. Because the building that people are used to, that structure, going into a building, sitting at your desk, working from 9 to 5, that's gone. And so now you have to replace it with supporting people, giving people flex time, enabling, empowering, and then you watch for performance. You don't monitor the process, you look at outcomes, and as a result, set the right expectations.
Thank you so much, Tsedal. Henna, any insights how you have implemented in the Cabinet Office to make this new arrangement more inclusive?
Yeah, so I've seen some references here like single moms, small apartments, domestic violence, etc. And for us, we have actually left our offices open for colleagues who are vulnerable, who may need to come into the office for a safer working environment. In addition, every single staff member had a work from home allowance to request equipment if they didn't have it in place already. And in addition to that as well, we changed the policies that our staff could access to make them more open and flexible. So some colleagues were able to change their working patterns. Colleagues were also given the option to change their working hours, so work flexibly. As Tsedal mentioned earlier about flexi time, that is a norm across the civil service. So contractually, we all have that entitlement, but it wasn't always implemented. So we've seen a lot of people start to actually take that up and say, well, I actually need a break of 2.5 hours during the day to look after my children, and then I'll log on later. Or some colleagues have completely said, I want to work part-time. I'll be online Monday to Wednesdays. And we've been encouraging line managers and leaders across the system to encourage that and support their staff. And it's one of the first situations in the world, I'd say, in history, where people come first. And we have to actually protect the workforce in an adult to adult tone, rather than it being a parental to child tone, as some organizations often have been structured, in terms of what Tsedal was mentioning earlier about the micromanaging too. That is a very old school way of working with your people and leading a workforce. So we're more in the position of giving our people the tools and options to choose what they need that will benefit them at the time and help them deliver better outcomes for us.
Thank you so much. Pedro, do you want to bring a couple of questions more from the audience? And we are gonna start to close soon.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a question about infrastructure. So remote working assumes some basic resources like a good computer, a good connection, proper access to software. In some countries, like in the example here of the question from Juan Camilo, like Colombia, governments cannot provide these resources to public servants. So what to do in these cases? And we have two questions that are related to mobility and going across borders. I'm reading one from Ariane Santoso. My question will be about labor mobility across borders. Now that companies have allowed remote working and arguably seeing success, how would that affect the general view about labor mobility? And there is a similar question from Archie Sharma from London. So I think this can be two topics. And one last point, if anyone wants to comment. Ong Hang brought some questions about relationships. Are there emerging lessons on how to build consensus among stakeholders virtually, how socialization changes, and how trust is built in these settings? Of course, we don't have time to exhaustively answer all these questions, so feel free to pick up on whatever you prefer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro.
So perhaps Henna can talk about the equipment piece.
Yeah, so Pedro, would you mind just repeating the equipment ones, please, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I can do it. So Juan Camilo from Colombia, he is saying that infrastructure is one of the basic things that Tsedal highlighted, that we need to cover when we are working remotely. But some countries, such as Colombia, they might not have the resources to provide that. So what they can do?
So I think in regards to that, I'd probably look at that in a similar way to industries that have had to completely shut down or stop working because they don't have the means to continue operating their business as they did before. So if you can't adapt the operating model in time, the biggest thing I would recommend is think about how you can contribute to the pandemic. How can you meet this demand in a way that you could apply your skills? So a really good example for us in the UK civil service is the industry partnership scheme that we created, where we employed furloughed workers to work with us in particular teams across departments. So they were workers who were previously working as, in restaurants, in airlines, and their industry just stopped to a halt. So we could then employ them into roles we had a really big demand for. So that would be something I would encourage, if it's possible in Colombia, to think about what does the country need at this current moment in time, and how can they pivot their resource to meet that demand.
I might pick up on the question of mobility with the labor mobility. So flex time is one gift that remote work can give, and labor mobility is another one, where talent pool, especially in certain areas, have been quite difficult for people to achieve. But what I'm hearing from many leaders, particularly in this past year, is they've had to experiment with mobility, not only from their domestic and very local people, but also outside of their localities. And they work. What we have seen in the last few months is evidence that remote work can be effective. We have seen evidence of that, which means that we can tap labor force depending on our need that are not located in our localities. And for us in the US, I think of rural workers who couldn't come to the urban areas, who now we can actually hire and have them join our organization, which is excellent for the economy versus just the urban areas. This is a whole new dimension that people can take advantage of. It's not just other countries, but it's something as simple as rural versus urban, or even from this state to that state.
Thank you so much, Tsedal and Henna. We are gonna start to close. I want really to thank you for joining this conversation. I think that we have discussed very important topic, and we can continue the conversation later, talking about how can we build trust. One of the big issues in government is trust, and it's not just inside of the organization, but also how can we build trust with the organization, public organizations, and citizens. I think that is one of the big challenges that we have. How can we also change the managerial practices thinking about different leaders, about different ways of leadership that we need to think. Motivation, one of the issues that we have found in the work that we are doing is like lack of motivation. How can we motivate people? Even because before in government, some public servants, they were having that lack of motivation. So how can we deal with that motivation? I see the hybrid model that you said, Tsedal. I also thought that it's an excellent, because it's gonna have also its challenges. So I see a lot of opportunities here. I see that also having remote work can help us to bring new talent. And that is something that we have been fighting in government. How can we retain, and develop the talent inside of government? How can we change the managerial practices? And also thinking in the future, modernize our processes inside of the government, and modernize the way that we are delivering public services. So I really appreciate your participation, your insights. It was so lovely to exchange ideas, and we will continue the conversation later. We are having our next talk in 2 weeks. Then I think of November, we're gonna be talking about data with the Bureaucracy Lab from the World Bank. So I hope to see our audience, and we will continue the conversation. Thank you so much to both of you and the audience.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
You too.